Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So I don't have a huge amount of time this morning to do these, but there were 2 points that I wanted to hit upon because I actually thought they were pretty decent conversations. So one of my subscribers, she pulled me into a conversation between herself and other YouTubers about this thing of Sanders and black voters. One of the commentators, what's her name? Noah. She has a really good show herself. She made a statement that I agree with some of what she says in the larger context of her conversation. But there's one particular point that I fundamentally disagree with. She says, not surprising. It's sad Senator Bernie Sanders' campaign never understood the value in connecting with black folks in the South. So, if I understand what they're saying, it's saying, I disagree with it because I'm pretty sure he understood the value of connecting with voters in the South. That's regardless of their race. Their race was immaterial. He wanted those voters, clearly. So, yeah, on that front, he clearly understood the value of it. The question I think she's getting at is, well, why couldn't he make that connection? I think that's the fundamental question, right? Like, ultimately, it's not so much that he didn't understand the value. Yes, he understood the value. But there's a difference in understanding the value of something and being able to articulate a message to get you that particular thing. The reason why I dislike the statement, and like I said, a lot of what she's saying I agree with. But there's a fundamental thing in the way African Americans vote that I think belies what she's saying on this front. Meaning that even in best case ideal situations, it wouldn't have mattered in regards to Sanders getting a large share of the black vote in the South. I don't think it does. So there are 4 reasons. And the last 2 are probably the 2 most important of those reasons. So the first one is, the narrative of Sanders being the candidate of whites. That's a Hillary Clinton brainchild. So that's right off the bat. When I hear people make this argument about Sanders being the white candidate, Sanders not communicating and not connecting with African Americans, I full well know that the narrative that the Hillary Clinton campaign put out, the brainchild of Tom Perez, was, let's define him as the white candidate. If we can define him as the white candidate and he's only there for white liberals, then we can put a certain stigma on him that makes other minorities stay away from him. This was a Tom Perez letter that he sent to the Hillary campaign. This was something that they actively promoted. There's a reason that this thing came up about African American voters during the primaries. And it was this amazing thing where you're looking at it saying, blacks make up 13% of the population. This sounds absolutely absurd to me. Yes, you're getting 90% of that population regardless of who wins the primary. But certainly you're going to need rural white voters who make up like 60, nearly 70% of the country. I mean, this narrative is always crazy to me. Now, so bake that into the cake. I mean, because that is true. That's just a fact. Their campaign was pushing this thing of this racial identity politics of sorts to say, we have all these minorities on our side. Sanders, he only gets whites and he only gets white liberals. That was a political stunt. I don't like this idea that the narrative has seeped into the public consciousness of sorts. The second part to that, the southern states came up before people even knew who Sanders was and before Sanders even fully realized that he had a chance to do anything in the primary. Meaning those states came up first. There's even an argument to be made on whether or not those states were put in first in the first place. Meaning preloading those states in the South meant that any kind of progressive candidate has to go through more conservative districts first. I don't know how much I believe that. What I do believe is that ultimately you have a candidate who nobody knows, who for the most part the media is ignored. They call the man a wild leftist, even though he's literally a classical Democrat. And ultimately, they cast him as this fringe candidate. So you're just getting into the contest, the media contests in the South are literally during the time where you're just now getting your name recognition out. Who is he reaching out to? And even if he does reach out to certain people, are black leftists that dominant where they're going to pull all these other people into the political process and change the minds of people in that process, even when they don't even know who that candidate is? I'm doubtful. I'm doubtful. I don't. The fact that he was starting that process off, and he started off, I think, like 3%. There was like a 60% difference between him and Hillary when he started. That was the time they were going through the South. It's not a situation where people even knew who Sanders was. Sanders didn't catch on fire until a little bit late in the campaign when he started getting more and more exposure. Yes, he opened his mouth and the things that he said pulled people in. But if nobody hears those things, if nobody's even aware of who that guy is, you're not going to get the bang for your buck that you're going to get. It took a while for him to seep into the public consciousness. 3. And this is the next two are probably the most glaring two that the statement kind of misses, or at the very least the statement ignores. It ignores the deficiency in the way blacks vote. We don't vote based on this kind of intellectual pursuit thing. That's not the way African Americans vote. Our experience in this country has pushed us to vote in a defensive way. Meaning, if somebody who's white, and they go to the polls and they make a vote, they can vote for pretty much any party, Republican or Democrat. It's their choice. African Americans full well understand that the only party they're really going to vote for is Democrat. Because ultimately, it's nothing about the Democrat. There's no real support for Hillary Clinton among blacks. It's not that. Ultimately, Hillary Clinton is going to get 90% of the vote because they full well understand that the people who hate them, who hate their identity, who's treated them bad and tried to subjugate them over the course of the last 50, 60, 100, 200 years, is in the other party. Meaning African Americans vote for the person, not necessarily because they have the best policies, but based upon who they think will be more likely to get elected. There is a difference in those things. It doesn't matter what Sanders was saying out of his mouth. Ultimately, it does boil down to, can he win? Can he win? Can he keep the goblin from coming into the house? If he can't keep the goblin from coming into the house, if we don't believe he can keep the goblin from coming out the house, then no, he's not getting our vote. And I saw this play out in real time. Al Sharpton invited Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders to, it was like a political thing. And as they were there, Sanders, the things that he was saying, people were more receptive to it. Al Sharpton didn't even want to give him the time of day. Al Sharpton was completely disinterested in conversation that was being had. But in this case, Al Sharpton is a hack. He's already said he doesn't really care what Obama says. He's not going to criticize the president. That's amazing. That's amazing. A, it's amazing you admit it. B, it's amazing that you do it. But in this particular case, he's sitting there with Hillary Clinton, fawning over her, full well knowing that the platitudes and stuff that are coming out of her mouth is bull and ridiculous. That didn't stop the people at that particular church from listening to her, and it didn't stop the people of that church, even though what Sanders was saying was more apt to help their particular situation, was more honest because he has a track record for it. It didn't matter. Ultimately, they looked at Hillary Clinton as being the person who they knew the most, the person who they thought they had a better chance of getting into that office, and ultimately, the person who they were going to end up voting for. It didn't matter what came out of Sanders' mouth. That was less important than whether or not they believed Sanders could get elected. And let's go back further on this. Do you remember back in 2008 when Obama was running against Hillary? Hillary Clinton was the favorite to win that contest, even among African Americans. Even among African Americans. Because they didn't believe that Obama, as a black candidate, could get elected. The moment that changed, yes, that's when that tide started to turn and people started to vote for him. But the idea that you had a candidate who was in that particular race, who was African American, who was saying things that was slightly more progressive than Hillary Clinton, and that person couldn't get traction until the mood changed. And people say, okay, this guy could get elected. Sanders is in a contest where the media and everybody else, for the most part, was somewhat looked down on him and made it look like he's some kind of fringe candidate. That's a hard hurdle to overcome. These people aren't necessarily, that's a hard hurdle to overcome when people are looking at a particular media and you're trying to get those people to come over to your side. Now, there's one last component to that that's damn important that runs through all of this. Number 4, legacy. Legacy. So, Sanders was able to get black youth. In fact, youth in general, he's able to get those people because those people essentially voted their hopes. They hadn't been beaten down over the years with this narrowed version of what's possible. Ultimately, the youth looked at it and said, yeah, I like what that guy is saying. I want my country to look that way. The older folks, the majority, unfortunately, said, yeah, that guy's a pie-in-the-sky dreamer, and I'd rather have this Hillary Clinton-esque, because ultimately she has a better chance of getting elected. That's where that came from. That had nothing to do with whether or not those people liked what Sanders was saying. They could have full well loved what Sanders was saying. And I'm saying this because I've had conversations with people who would say, yeah, it would be nice if he could, do that, but I just don't think he can get elected. Literally. I mean, that was the conversation. They had no understanding whatsoever on the mood of the country. They didn't even fully understand politics. What they understood was, we got to keep that goblin out of office. Hillary Clinton is our best chance of keeping that goblin out of office. It's like, how do you get around that? And like I said, the fourth one, legacy. Legacy. When Obama was out there giving his speeches, he started using his race, literally shilling his race, to try to get Hillary Clinton elected. Using terms like, this is my legacy and everything else. They billed her campaign as Obama 2.0. From the beginning, they billed a campaign as, you like the progress that the president made? I think that progress is non-existent. But you like the progress that the president made? Good. Vote Hillary Clinton. I am Obama 2.0, and I'm going to continue the way things are. Status quo. 101. Status quo forever. That is my role in this campaign. If you want to keep the Affordable Care Act, vote Hillary Clinton. Now, this is a ridiculous situation. The Affordable Care Act still doesn't cover millions of people, but because it was a black person that put that particular act in place and they wanted to protect his legacy, they were willing to fight for that legacy, even though what Sanders was saying was asking for single payer. Now, this is an amazing thing, and this is why I say legacy, race, and all these things factor into this, more so than I think the question, or more so than I think she realizes. I've had conversations with people. I've watched people give this conversation of, yeah, I like what he's saying, but I don't want to undo the Affordable Care Act. Obama put that in. This stuff is boiled down to legacy. I've seen people make these ridiculous, batshit crazy arguments about how something that Obama is doing, and they are justified, even though Bush did the exact same thing, and they would condemn him for it. These wars of aggression, these murdering people abroad, these going into other countries, unilaterally making decisions that kills thousands and thousands of people. We don't care about the law, our own laws. We don't care about international law. They would do it willy-nilly. I heard, what's the guy's name? Dyson. Dyson had a conversation with, it was a debate with Glenn Ford. And the entire conversation of the debate was, yeah, Obama didn't have a choice. He had to do those things. He had to do those grisly, murderous things. So, yeah, he couldn't do anything about pot legislation. So, yeah, those people still had to get locked up. No, he couldn't stop the drones from murdering civilians. No, he couldn't stop expanding 2 wars to 8. No, he had to pass the National Defense Authorization Act. He couldn't do any of that stuff. All of these things boil down to these people being apologists for one reason. We need to protect the legacy and the image of the black president. Sanders doesn't protect that legacy. Hillary Clinton protects that legacy. And the way she cast herself for the entire campaign was, if you want to protect that president's legacy, if you want your black president's legacy to continue, I am your choice. I am the one that he's picking for that particular choice. I am the guy that you need to choose. That argument is less relevant to the youth. That argument is yet less relative to the younger you get. So in your 30s, yeah, that argument doesn't carry water because you didn't necessarily think Obama did a good job. You might not have hated him per se, but you damn sure looked at the world around you and realized that the world around you was not all that great, and going for a 2.0 was not necessarily something you wanted to do. So that argument didn't necessarily work with you at 30. I would even make the argument at 40. But above that, yes, that argument worked. Yes, that argument worked. You talk to your grandparents, you talk to many of the other adults, those people who are plugged into evening news, those people who are just plugged into CNN and all this idea of politics is, in that sense. Not necessarily paying attention to it from moment to moment, but more so their idea of it, their vision of the world, their conception of reality, their political conception of reality. Yeah, those people were functioning under that model. You can talk to those people and they'll say, yes, I'm voting for Hillary Clinton. Why are you voting for Hillary Clinton? Well, because I think she's great for the black community. What does that mean? Great in what way? They couldn't necessarily answer that question because the question wasn't fully based off of them doing something for some hopeful, positive message. It was more so based off of, we need to keep that guy out of office. This is the best person to do that, to keep that guy out of office. And this person, who's donning herself in the whole Obama thing, she's just rubbing herself as from Obama. She was doing it for a reason. She wanted to paint herself as being Obama 2.0. The point I'm getting at in making these 4 points is that, yes, you can always say that he could have did more. But you're in a campaign where you have finite resources. He had just started the campaign. He had little to no money to his name. He started to bring in money. And you're stuck with a dilemma. How are you going to best use those resources to get you to where you're trying to get to? With those resources, however he was going to use those resources, I don't even know how you would have used those resources. Confronted with these 4 elements, meaning brand new to the campaign, nobody knew who he was, and in addition to nobody knowing who he was, he had this deficiency where clearly he was not the second coming of Obama in that case, and yes, he was going to probably undo elements of that legacy to go further than the small, tedious things that Obama tried to put through. When you're confronted with that, and you understand the reality of that, and you're running a campaign, I don't know what your behavior is going to be in regards to how much resources you want to devote to that process. I can agree with you that, yes, I would have wished Sanders went further on a lot of that stuff. I would have wished you went more so for the throat early on. All that stuff is true. I agree. But I think my disagreement is the amount of how bullish I am on this idea of, well, he should have had more outreach. Because my question becomes, well, what is that outreach going to tangibly give him in these early southern states when nobody even knew who he was? That's what I'm getting at. And this thing of the narrative being created by the Clinton campaign, I damn sure don't accept that particular narrative at all. The man blew away in Hawaii and Washington State. Both of those states are the most diverse in the nation. It's not an issue of race. Ultimately, they made it an issue of race because they wanted to separate by identity. But I don't accept that as being true. I don't accept that being true at all. We have a particular way in which we vote. That needs to be acknowledged. In any lens that you put on Sanders, if you're going to make this case that says Republicans vote for things other than their own economic well-being, and I agree with that. I agree with that. I don't think anybody can make this argument that people are voting Republican because it's in their best interest. Blacks do the same thing for the Democratic Party. We vote defensively. We don't vote for a message. We don't necessarily vote because we want this particular person. We vote purely because this person keeps that goblin out of office. The fact that this person is also a goblin is less relevant than keeping that goblin out of office, because that's always the person we're paying attention to. Our well-being, our physical well-being is at stake because we have a cultural memory of the things that took place in this particular country. So I don't think it's fair, or at the very least, I don't think it's as straightforward as saying Sanders should have had more community outreach among blacks. I just don't know what that would have gotten early on in the campaign. Maybe as the campaign got rolling, people knew who he was. Fair enough. But in the very beginning of the process in the South, I fundamentally disagree. And look, like I said, I agree with most of what Anoa said on this point. It's just this very particular point is somewhat of a pet peeve because I know that that's one of those narratives that the Clinton campaign created out of whole cloth to attack the guy with race. I don't particularly like it, and I'm damn sure not falling into that particular pattern of thought. But full well, but I understand that ultimately there's certain ways in which we vote that work against Sanders in that case, if that makes sense. It's almost like we're structurally biased to go against a particular narrative in that case. Not the youth. The youth vote is for the most part just the honest vote of this is what I want the country to be. But the youth vote is not the thing that full well determined the election. It's not. And ultimately you can even make the case that ultimately the reason Sanders lost that primary was because they cheated, not because of the quote-unquote outreach. There was always a gradient that he would have had to overcome, just because nobody knew who he was. Media and all that other stuff was things that he had to overcome. Even getting money at that point, because initially he had no resources for the campaigns. Those are things he had to overcome. The reality of the situation is that ultimately he had to start somewhere. Ultimately his campaign had to kind of kick up a little dust. Ultimately, he was going to hit some primaries before people full well even understood who Sanders was and why they wanted to put him in that office. And yeah, at the very end of it, you still ran into this thing of whether or not African Americans could see him as being electable, and whether or not one person was more apt to maintain the legacy of the first black president and somebody who instills him with a certain amount of esteem, as opposed to the other person who's saying something that's better, who wants to go further. But ultimately, will undo elements of that particular legacy, because if we're being honest, that legacy is ghastly. The legacy is ghastly. So that's my take on it. Yeah, I'll leave it there. If you enjoyed the content, feel free to share, like, subscribe, and you can always support the work through Patreon.